20 minutes. That is how long it took someone to know, not guess, not speculate. No. On April 17, 2026, 20 minutes before Iran's foreign minister posted on social media that the Strait of Hormuz was open to commercial shipping, traders placed bets worth $760 million that oil prices would fall. 20 minutes before the announcement, $760 million. And that is not the only time this happened. On March 23, 15 minutes before Trump announced he would delay threatened strikes on Iran's power grid, traders bet more than $500 million that oil prices would fall. On April 7, hours before Trump announced a temporary ceasefire, traders bet $960 million that oil prices would fall. And on April 21, 15 minutes before Trump announced he would extend the ceasefire, traders placed bets worth $430 million that oil prices would fall. 4 separate events, 4 separate windows of advance knowledge, $2.6 billion total in precisely timed trades that preceded major war announcements by minutes in 3 of the 4 cases. The Department of Justice is now investigating, according to ABC reporting. But here is the question that the Dodge investigation is not asking, and that nobody covering this conflict with sufficient seriousness is asking directly. If someone had advance knowledge of those 4 announcements with enough confidence to place multi-$100 million trades 15 to 20 minutes before each one, what else? Do they know? And what does their advance knowledge of the negotiations tell you about how real the progress that has been described as great actually is? Because the pattern of $2.6 billion in front-run trades does not describe a chaotic and unpredictable negotiating environment where the outcome is genuinely uncertain. It describes an environment where specific outcomes are known to specific people before they are announced, and the question of who those people are. And what else they know is the most important unanswered question about this entire conflict. That is not the only thing you need to understand about where this war actually stands right now, but it is the lens through which everything else needs to be read. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why the oil market front-running story is not a financial sidebar to the main geopolitical narrative, but actually the most revealing available indicator of the gap between the official communications about this conflict and the operational reality underlying them, you need to understand everything else that came out in the past 72 hours that puts the front running in its full strategic context. Here is where we stand as of this week. Project Freedom, the armed escort initiative launched by the United States to restore freedom of navigation to commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, was rolled out on Sunday with major announcements: 15,000 service members committed, over 100 aircraft, guided missile destroyers, and the full weight of the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group committed to the operation. The operation was implemented by CENTCOM. It produced results on day 1. 6 Iranian fast attack boats sunk, 2 commercial vessels through the strait. 2 destroyers through the strait, 100% intercept rate on every Iranian weapon system directed at the escort force. And then on Tuesday, the same operation was paused, not because it was not working, because according to Wall Street Journal reporting, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait told the United States they could not use their bases and airspace to conduct the mission anymore. As of today, the operation may be back on. 5 days, one of the largest logistical naval missions the United States has executed in decades, announced to the world with the full weight of U.S. military commitment, rolled out, implemented, paused when Gulf allies refused to support it, and potentially restarted. That is the operational summary of the past 5 days. Chaos across the board, a lot of movement, not a lot of progress, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, $2.6 billion in oil market trades executed with timing that the Department of Justice has now found suspicious enough to open an investigation. Now let me give you the CIA assessment that was published in the Washington Post this week, because this is the intelligence finding that every other element of the current situation needs to be read against. A confidential CIA analysis delivered to administration policymakers concluded that Iran can survive the U.S. naval blockade for at least 3 to 4 months before facing more severe economic hardship. Read that assessment with the precision it requires, not 3 to 4 months until regime collapse, not 3 to 4 months until the URG rebels against its leadership, not 3 to 4 months until the Iranian people rise up in a successful revolution, 3 to 4 months until Iran faces more severe economic hardship. That is the specific threshold the CIA identified. Hardship more severe than current hardship after 3 to 4 months of blockade. Not a different Iran, not a transformed political situation, more severe economic hardship. And then a U.S. official speaking to the Washington Post added the assessment that makes the CIA estimate look optimistic. They thought Iran's capacity to endure prolonged economic hardship is far greater than even the CIA estimate. The leadership has gotten more radical, determined, and increasingly confident they can outlast U.S. political will and sustain domestic repression to check any resistance. Read those 2 assessments together. The CIA says 3 to 4 months until more severe hardship. A senior U.S. official says Iran's actual capacity is far greater than even that. And the official describes an Iranian leadership that has become more radical, more determined, and more confident about outlasting American political will. That is not the description of an organization approaching a deal. It is the description of an organization that believes the pressure is producing a different response in Tehran than the one it was designed to produce, not capitulation, consolidation. Now let me give you the specific historical comparison that the CIA's sources referenced, because it is the one that every analysis of sanctions-based coercion strategies has to account for, and that the optimistic timeline for this conflict's resolution has been systematically underweighting. North Korea has been effectively shut off from the entire world economy for decades. North Korea is still there. North Korea is still a menace. North Korea's leadership has demonstrated repeatedly that it is willing to impose levels of economic suffering on its own population that would be politically impossible for any democratic government to sustain, and that would generate regime change in any country whose population had the ability to organize effective resistance. North Korea is the extreme data point. Iran is not North Korea. The comparison is imperfect in multiple specific ways. Iran has a larger middle class with higher economic expectations. Iran has a more connected population that remembers a different standard of living before the Islamic Revolution. Iran has a history of protest movements that have come closer to threatening the regime than anything North Korea has produced in decades. The comparison is not one-to-one, but the principle it illustrates is the one the CIA assessment and the U.S. officials' assessment are both pointing toward. Regimes with sufficient internal repression capacity, sufficient indifference to the suffering of their own populations, and sufficient institutional cohesion within the security apparatus that enforces that repression can survive sustained economic pressure for much longer than the optimistic scenarios for economic coercion predict. And the assessment that Iran's leadership has become more radical, more determined, and more confident they can outlast US political will is describing a regime that is moving toward the North Korea end of that spectrum rather than toward the rapid capitulation end that the administration's optimistic public statements have implied. Now let me give you the missile inventory assessment, because it contradicts what has been publicly stated about the success of Operation Epic Fury's targeting of Iranian ballistic missile capability in ways that matter enormously for understanding the threat environment in the Strait right now. The CIA analysis concluded that Iran retains approximately 75% of its pre-war inventories of missile launchers and approximately 70% of its pre-war stockpiles of missiles. Read those percentages against the 85% degradation figure that Trump stated publicly. They do not match. The CIA is saying 75% of launchers remain and 70% of missiles remain. Trump said 85% of missile-making capability has been eliminated. One of those assessments is more accurate than the other. The evidence that the CIA analysis cites for its assessment includes intelligence showing that Iran has been able to recover and reopen almost all of its underground storage facilities, repair some damaged missiles, and even assemble some new missiles that were nearly complete when the war began. Read that specific detail. Almost all underground storage facilities reopened, some damaged missiles repaired, new missiles assembled from near-complete inventory during the ceasefire window. That is the operational picture of an Iranian missile program that absorbed the initial strike campaign with more resilience than the official damage assessments suggested, and that used the ceasefire period to actively reconstitute rather than passively accept the damage. The assessment that Iran retains 70% of pre-war missile stockpiles during a ceasefire in which Trump has been repeatedly threatening to resume bombing is either a significant intelligence failure in the initial damage assessment or evidence that the initial official statements about missile capability degradation were optimistic in ways that served a public communication objective, rather than reflecting the most accurate available intelligence picture. The CIA analysis, delivered confidentially to administration policymakers, suggests the latter. This assessment is consistent with something else in the picture. Iran's public negotiating posture has hardened rather than softened as the blockade has continued. The 14-point peace proposal that Iran submitted demanded a full U.S. military withdrawal from the region, immediate lifting of the blockade, release of frozen assets, war reparations, and Iranian control over a new international Strait of Hormuz governance mechanism. That is a negotiating position that asks for more than Iran had before the war began. An adversary in the process of collapsing under economic pressure does not ask for more than it had before the pressure was applied. An adversary that has made an accurate assessment of its own resilience and of the timeline constraints on the pressuring party's political will, asks for everything it wants and waits to see what the pressuring party's next move is. The combination of the CIA's 3 to 4 month timeline, the U.S. officials' even more pessimistic assessment of Iranian endurance, the 70% retained missile inventory, and the demand posture that asks for more than pre-war conditions is describing a regime that is not approaching capitulation on a short timeline. It is describing a regime that is playing the patience game it has played for decades and betting that American political will has a shorter half-life than Iranian institutional endurance. That bet has worked before. The CIA analysis is suggesting it might be working again. Now let me give you the Gulf ally dimension in the full detail it requires, because the Wall Street Journal report about Saudi Arabia and Kuwait blocking us use of their bases and airspace is not a minor diplomatic complication. It is a strategic signal that deserves the analytical attention that most coverage has not given it. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait blocked the U.S. military's use of their bases and airspace after senior American officials played down Iranian attacks on the Persian Gulf in response to Project Freedom. The Saudis and the Gulf states were concerned that the United States would not protect them amid the escalation in fighting. Saudi Arabia grew alarmed that the U.S. would not respond forcefully enough to further attacks after the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Kane, dismissed Iran's strikes on ships and the way as low-level harassment. And when US officials affirmed that the ceasefire was holding, read that sequence carefully, Iran conducted kinetic attacks against multiple vessels and struck the Way's Fujairah oil facility. The United States characterized those attacks as low-level harassment and declared the ceasefire still holding. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, the countries whose territory and bases would be required to sustain Project Freedom's air operations, concluded from that characterization that the United States was not willing to respond forcefully to Iranian attacks and therefore was not willing to protect the Gulf states from the Iranian retaliation that would follow their participation in Project Freedom. And the Gulf states drew the logical conclusion that a country focused on a deal at all costs would expect them to absorb Iranian attacks as acceptable collateral to the deal-making process while providing the military infrastructure that enabled the deal-forcing operations. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait said no, and that no forced the pause of Project Freedom that the administration had to explain to the world as being about diplomatic progress rather than allied defection. That sequence is the most revealing thing about the current state of American strategic credibility with its Gulf partners that has emerged from this entire conflict. The United States spent decades building a security architecture in the Gulf that depended on Gulf partner trust that American military commitment was unconditional enough to absorb the political risk of hosting American forces and operations. The General Kane characterization of Iranian missile and drone strikes on Way infrastructure as low-level harassment communicated to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait that the current administration's threshold for forceful response was higher than the threshold they needed to justify continued partnership. If Iran can strike Way oil infrastructure and the American military characterizes it as low-level harassment that does not disrupt a ceasefire, then the Gulf states are being asked to accept Iranian attacks on their territory as the price of supporting American military operations. That is a price that Saudi Arabia and Kuwait decided not to pay. And the forced pause of Project Freedom is the consequence. Not the deal progress that the administration's communications emphasized, but the Allied refusal that the Wall Street Journal reported. The two explanations for the pause, diplomatic progress and Allied defection, are not mutually exclusive. Both can be true simultaneously. But the one that carries more strategic weight for the long-term American position in the Gulf is the Allied defection story, and that is the one that received less coverage proportional to its strategic significance. Now let me address the oil market front-running story in the full depth it deserves, because $2.6 billion in suspiciously timed trades preceding for major war announcements is not a financial curiosity. It is evidence of an information environment in which the official communications about this conflict are not the primary channel through which consequential information is moving. Let me give you each trade in sequence with its timing and scale. March 23rd, 15 minutes before Trump announced he would delay threatened attacks. On Iran's power grid, traders bet more than $500 million that oil prices would fall. Oil prices fall when conflict risk decreases. A delayed attack on Iran reduces conflict risk. If you know 15 minutes before the announcement that the attack is being delayed, you know oil prices are about to fall and you bet accordingly. That is insider trading in a financial market. It is also evidence that the decision to delay the attack was known to specific people 15 minutes before it was announced publicly. April 7th, hours before Trump announced a temporary ceasefire, traders bet $960 million that oil prices would fall. $960 million hours before. The ceasefire announcement produced the single largest pre-announcement oil market position of the four documented events. Someone knew the ceasefire was coming hours before it was announced, April 17th. 20 minutes before Iran's foreign minister posted on social media that the Strait of Hormuz was open, traders bet $760 million that oil prices would fall. This is the one that should produce the most serious questions about the integrity of the negotiating environment. 20 minutes before a diplomatic posting that changed the global oil price environment, $760 million was positioned to profit from that change. April 21st, 15 minutes before Trump announced he would extend the ceasefire, traders placed $430 million in positions betting oil prices would fall. 15 minutes. The Department of Justice is investigating, but the investigation describes trades obtained from the London Stock Exchange Group data, meaning the trades are documented. The timing is documented, the scale is documented. What the investigation is presumably trying to establish is who made these trades and how they knew what they knew when they knew it. That answer, when it arrives, will be one of the most consequential revelations to emerge from this entire conflict, because the people who knew in advance when ceasefires were being announced, when attacks were being delayed, when the Strait of Hormuz was being declared open, are the people who knew the most sensitive information in the most consequential conflict the Middle East has seen in decades, and they used that information to make money. Now let me bring the three-track convergence into the full picture, because the CIA assessment, the Gulf Allied defection, the oil market front-running, and the Project Freedom pause and restart cycle all converge on the same underlying reality about where this conflict actually sits. The first track is the timeline track. The CIA analysis says 3 to 4 months of blockade before more severe economic hardship. A senior US official says even that timeline underestimates Iranian endurance. The blockade has been active for less than a month since April 13th. The administration's public statements have implied a short timeline resolution driven by Iranian economic capitulation. The CIA analysis says the short timeline assumption is wrong, and the administration knows it is wrong because the analysis was delivered to administration policymakers. The gap between the public optimism about a deal and the CIA's confidential assessment of the timeline is the first track's contribution to the convergence. The second track is the Allied credibility track. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait blocked us base and airspace access because they concluded the United States was focused on a deal at all costs while expecting Gulf states to absorb Iranian kinetic attacks as acceptable collateral. That conclusion produced the forced pause of Project Freedom. The forced pause produced the diplomatic explanation that made it look like progress rather than Allied defection. The diplomatic explanation was accurate about progress but incomplete about the defection. The Gulf allies are still there. They are still partners, but they drew a line about what they would accept as the cost of partnership. And they drew it at the moment that mattered most for the primary operation designed to demonstrate American commitment to freedom of navigation. That is the second track's contribution to the convergence. The third track is the information integrity track, $2.6 billion in pre-announcement oil market positions, documented and now under Dodge investigation, describing a pattern that is statistically inconsistent with random coincidence at the timing precision documented across 4 separate events. That pattern tells you that sensitive information about this conflict's diplomatic trajectory has been moving through channels that produced financial positions before public announcements. The information integrity track does not tell you who is responsible. The Dodge investigation is presumably working toward that answer, but it does tell you that the official communications about negotiations, ceasefires, and deal progress have been preceded by information moving in private channels with enough specificity and confidence to justify betting hundreds of millions of dollars against oil prices. At 15 to 20-minute advance notice, that is not a coincidence pattern. That is an information leak pattern. And it changes how every official communication about progress in the Iran negotiations should be read, because at least some of those communications have been preceded by private information flows that produced financial positions suggesting that the people with advance access to that information knew what the communications would say before they were said. Here is the honest strategic assessment that the combination of the CIA timeline analysis, the Gulf Ally defection, the Project Freedom pause and restart cycle, and the oil market front-running produces. This conflict is not heading toward a short timeline resolution driven by Iranian economic capitulation. The CIA's confidential assessment says 3 to 4 months until more severe hardship. A senior US official says even that underestimates Iranian endurance. The Iranian leadership has become more radical and more confident. Iran retains 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait have already demonstrated that their support for American operations has conditions that the current administration's characterization of Iranian attacks as low-level harassment has endangered. The Project Freedom initiative that was supposed to demonstrate American commitment to freedom of navigation was paused within 5 days of its launch because Gulf allies withdrew the base access required to sustain it, and $2.6 billion in oil market trades preceding for major announcements by minutes is describing an information environment in which the official communications about this conflict are downstream of private information flows that are generating significant financial positions before the communications are made public. That combination does not describe a conflict approaching resolution on a deal or bombing timeline driven by economic pressure that produces Iranian capitulation. It describes a conflict that may go on for 3 to 4 months at minimum before reaching the economic hardship level the CIA identified as the first threshold. Within adversary leadership that believes it can outlast American political will pass that threshold, with Gulf allies whose continued support is conditional on American responses to Iranian attacks that the current characterization as low-level harassment has already endangered, and with an information environment whose integrity is under active Dodge investigation. The official narrative and the operational reality are not the same story. They are 2 stories being told simultaneously to 2 different audiences, and the $2.6 billion in front-run trades is the most concrete available evidence of who is reading the private version. The assessment from the source who spoke to the Washington Post is the sentence that should be read carefully in full. Comparatively, you see similar regimes lasting years under sustained embargoes and air power-only wars. That sentence contains the most important analytical frame for this conflict that the official public communications have been least willing to incorporate: air power-only wars, economic blockades without regime change operations. Historical examples of regimes that survived both for years: North Korea survived, Cuba survived, Iran survived the original sanctions regime for decades before this conflict. The administration's public position is that the blockade will force a deal or enable a resumption of strikes at higher intensity. The CIA's confidential assessment is that the Iranian regime's capacity to endure is far greater than even the CIA estimate. The gap between those 2 positions is where the next 3 to 4 months of this conflict will play out. The oil traders who placed $760 million 15 minutes before the straight opening announcement apparently knew something about that timeline that the public communications were not conveying. And the Dodge investigation is now trying to find out who they are and how they knew it. That investigation may be the most consequential development in this conflict that nobody is treating as the headline it deserves. Because if the investigation establishes that senior officials with access to the most sensitive negotiating information were simultaneously profiting from it in oil markets, the credibility of every public communication about deal progress, ceasefire status, and strategic pressure effectiveness becomes retroactively questionable in ways that the conflict's analysis has to account for. Project Freedom launched, Project Freedom paused, Project Freedom may be restarting. The CIA says 3 to 4 months until more severe hardship. An official says even that underestimates Iranian endurance. Iran has 70% of its pre-war missile stockpile. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait blocked us base access because the United States called Iranian attacks on way infrastructure low-level harassment. $2.6 billion was bet in oil markets at 15 to 20-minute advance notice before 4 major war announcements. The Department of Justice is investigating, and the conflict is entering a phase that may look much more like a sustained economic siege than the rapid resolution scenario the optimistic timeline projected. Every time there is an announcement that there is progress, someone appears to know 15 minutes before. Every time there is a pause, someone appears to have bet hundreds of millions on the direction of oil prices before the pause was announced, and the conflict itself may be heading into the 3 to 4 month endurance window that the CIA identified as the minimum before more severe hardship, with Gulf allies already demonstrating their support as conditions, and with a leadership in Tehran that is described as increasingly confident it can outlast American political will. Sleep peacefully knowing that somewhere, as you watch these announcements go up and down and sideways, someone is making generational wealth on the information gap between what is known privately and what is announced publicly. The Dodge is working on identifying who. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does the conflict resolve within the next 30 days, or does the CIA's 3 to 4 month timeline prove accurate and the optimistic public narrative prove to be what the front-running traders apparently knew it was before the rest of us found out? Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next announcement is coming 15 minutes before it. Someone apparently already knows. We will see you in the next one.